Welcome, friend. Dr. Grant Wiedenfeld here. I am still in the weeds trying to understand Aristotle's Poetics. And this second of two lectures is really going to focus on details of plot. He's already defined, poetry as storytelling, stories in a way, and tragedy as those stories that are acted out versus epic, where it's told and narrated. I think these details of plot will apply to both epic and probably comedy as well, although that treatise is lost. So first, he says that plot is the most important. So let me start out there and what he means by plot. He says tragedy is a representation not of persons but of actions. So he's going to be against, let me tell you the life story of so-and-so. No. He would much rather focus on one specific thing that a person does, or a thing, some action that multiple people are involved in. So jumping back up the page here, and this is the Anthony Kenny translation. First, he has this, the 6 elements of tragedy there in the middle. The story, the moral element, the style, the ideas, the staging, and the music. Okay, what does he mean by story? Goes up to the top. That means the plot of the events. These are the, what is happening in the action. And after that, he explains the moral character is what makes us evaluate agents in particular ways, while ideas are what are expressed in the speeches. So all of those are important. There are ideas that are coming across here in representation. There are morals that are coming across. But, for him, the basis of poetry, the full art of, I think, movies here is the plot. This is for him the basis of the form around which everything else, the skeleton around which everything else hangs. Jumping to the next page, he starts to give some characteristics of, okay, what is a good plot? He doesn't exactly say the kinds of things that will happen. Again, it's the logical focus here. Like a scientist from the outside trying to understand what are the abstract qualities here. And this sounds like a logician here. Okay, it should be complete. What does it complete mean? Oh, well, it means it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, it almost sounds redundant to say that. But if you look closely at how he defines it, these kind of definitions, these details can be useful for, analyzing a story, especially if you're a filmmaker. So what is a beginning? He says it isn't arbitrary. A beginning is, an item that does not itself follow necessarily upon something else. So you don't need to know what happened before. Maybe there are things in the past, but there isn't necessity for knowing all of that. But there is necessity for knowing what's going to happen afterward. Often this is called an inciting incident. There's some incident that happens, just kind of arises, and now there are going to be consequences. We have to know what those consequences are. So a middle is, of course, it's a consequence of one thing, and it's going to have consequences towards another. In effect, the middle is it falls between the beginning and the end, and the end is, it follows necessarily from something else, but then, the story does not have to go on afterward. So it's a real logical definition of, the completeness of the story, that the beginning and the end, that the necessity of having to know what happens before and after those points stops there. There's some stops there. And the middle is everything in between. Now, is this necessarily a 3-act structure that, you have to have a beginning act, a middle act, and a third act? I don't think so. I think he's just saying, the beginning and the end have to be here, and the middle has to hold the middle is going to hold it together. But it could be 3x, 4x, 5x, what have you. Okay, the next element of plot that he talks about is scale. I really like this idea of scale because he says that if a story is too short, it can't be beautiful. It's not going to have multiple parts that you can appreciate how this complex thing is put together if it's just so brief. But it can't be so long that you can't even remember what all the parts are that fit together. So in the end, he says it's something that can be held in memory. The same kind of logic also appears in his metaphysics. It's all about the relationship of the parts and the whole. So it has to be big enough so that there could be multiple parts, but not so big that we can't figure out how all of those things fit together into one whole. And then there at the end, this is not necessarily so related to scale, but just a little hint on what he means by action and what's happening. It's a transformation from adversity to prosperity, or prosperity to adversity. Okay, probable or necessary sequence of events. But it's that transformation, that there's something that's changing in the character or in the world, that this is the essence of the action and the drama. I think this note right here would suggest that it's the transformation in fortune is how he thinks about it, but it could also be in a coming of age novel, a transformation in personality, or some other aspect of psychology or society that's changing. Third element he says here is unity. Again, this is the parts all being unified into one whole. So the center should be the action, not just a single person. All kinds of random things happen to a person in their life. That does not make for a coherent action, a unified action. What he says down there in the end is that if you remove any one of the parts, any element of the story, it would kind of break up the whole. If the story is really well put together, everything has to be in there. If you take it out, it's going to somehow disturb the whole. Okay. Now there's this next section where he kind of, that I want to jump to, where he kind of compares fiction, poetry as fiction, to history, nonfiction. And remember, he might be replying here to Plato and Socrates, who are like, poets are making up stories about things they don't know. You'd have to be a god to be a good poet. Aristotle does not take that approach. He says the poet's job is not relating what actually happened, history, but rather the kind of thing that would happen. That is to say, what is possible in terms of probability and necessity. So plausible is another word that comes up here for fiction. So the difference between a historian and a poet is not a matter of using verse or prose. The difference is that one relates what actually happened and the other the kind of events that would happen. Okay, and then the next line following that is important. For this reason, poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history. Quite a claim here. Poetry utters universal truths, history particular statements. So why is poetry more and more philosophical? Of course, philosophy is the best thing in the world that there can be for Aristotle. Why is poetry closer to that than writing history? Well, because what's plausible, this is following universal laws. Versus the particular events, these can change. There's randomness involved. there are many different choices that are involved. It's hard to understand why particular things happen. The scientific approach here, we want to understand the laws of the universe, the laws of what it means to be a human being. What are the principles, the first principles that are always true? And these are the universal truths that he sees fiction as communicating. So the aim of poetry, even though it's going to use proper names and seem to be particular, is that it's following these universal truths, teaching us something about general knowledge, general wisdom. Now, a couple pages later, he says, there's a couple other elements that distinguish the kind of plots that he calls complex plots, and that's reversal and discovery. Reversal, also known as a twist, a plot twist, is a change in the direction of the course of events, as I already stated, taking place always in accord with probability and necessity. Okay, so he gives an example here. Often, this is like a turning point or plot point. Reversal. Discovery is slightly different, and this is a change from ignorance to knowledge. Somebody is learning something. And at the end of this paragraph, he says that the one that has the most to do with story and the most to do with action is described. Reversal and discovery together will evoke either pity or fear, just the kind of actions with that define tragedy and bring about the happy or unhappy ending. So notice that can be happy or unhappy. And and the ideal for him is reversal and discovery happening at the same time. So you discover some kind of information that reverses the course of events, it changes the direction of things. That makes sense. And then in the other kind of note here, which is kind of added on, is that there's another component, suffering, which is action involving pain or destruction, such as murders on stage, extreme agony, woundings, and so on. He doesn't say much about it, but when you think of something like horror, crime, you can see that this is an element that Aristotle talks about. Okay, a little bit more on pity and fear here. So in these kind of guidelines on what makes for excellent tragedy and guidelines for plot construction, remember, what is tragedy? It's not unhappiness. It's a story about people that are better than the average Joe. And here you're going to see a little bit of the moral aspect of Aristotle that follows from Plato, who morality is really the focus of Plato's philosophy overall, but it still appears here. So it is clear, first of all, that good men should not be shown passing from good fortune to bad, for that evokes not fear or pity, but outrage. Nor should depraved men be shown passing from bad fortune to good. This is indeed at least the least tragic of all. It has none of the appropriate features, evoking neither pity nor fear or even the basic human sympathy. Finally, a very wicked man should not be shown passing from good fortune to bad. We might have sympathetic for this bad person who's fallen on even worse times, but we're not necessarily going to pity them or have any fear. Okay, so pity has to do with undeserved misfortune. It's kind of injustice. That's something that you can pity, someone who's suffering injustice. And fear, someone who is like ourselves. So that leaves him with this formula: a man who is not outstanding in virtue or justice, brought down through vice or depravity, who falls into adversity not through vice or depravity, but because he errs in some way. All right, so tragedy, they're better than us, but here we're not in the world of gods, because they, how could you, again, like Plato, nothing bad should happen to the gods. They should be timeless. So here it's going to be a level below, and someone better than us, but not quite a god. And this is why we can pity them and experience the emotion of fear, because there's identifying with them. Okay, those are most of the key elements that I wanted to emphasize. A little cringe moment here, as he keeps talking about moral character. Well, not at first. At first, he sounds quite universal, like moral character can be shown for anyone, possible in every class of person. There is such a thing as a good woman and a good slave. And then he just asked to be canceled when he said, even if one of those is inferior and the other base. Okay, so it's very sexist and classist here. You could tell he comes from an aristocratic family, and the sense that women and slaves are a lower class of people, totally unacceptable today. It's even worse down here. He says, appropriateness. It is no good for a character to be courageous if the courage or intelligence isn't expressed in a way that is not appropriate for a woman. Excuse me? Is there an appropriate way for women to be courageous and not? Okay, yeah, well, you can tell he was writing in 330 BC here. Not insignificant though. Let's not forget that as we go on. So, last slide here. I just want to, at the end of the book, he makes a couple other comparisons between epic and tragedy, following on same themes as before. Okay, remember, epic is something that's narrated, so it can take place over a long period of time that's compressed. And another interesting thing, because it's narrated, you can have simultaneous incidents playing out at once. And this is a great thing about film, can do this as well. Parallel editing is the term for it. Best examples often shown in film history are Fritz Lang's M, or The Godfather, the baptism scene at the end. That it's hard in theater when people are on the stage to move from different settings and different parallel actions in the movie, but you can do this if you have a narrator, which you do in a novel, a story, an epic that's told, or in movies. And then, nevertheless, that doesn't make it better than tragedy for him. Team tragedy here, Aristotle says that tragedy is best because it's more concentrated. Epic can cover a lot more things. That's great, but he feels like the catharsis is greater because the action here is concentrated into the 24-hour period, and that concentrates the pleasure as well. And yes, that's about it in the conclusion. A couple of final thoughts. The logic is so strong in Aristotle. You wonder, are his principles for criticism really guided by experience of, seeing plays and hearing stories, or are they just guided by the logic of a logician, a scientist who's coming up with, who's following the logic of his argument? Has he necessarily tested them out? That's not clear. So that's one reason to be skeptical. Also, as far as the space for creativity, it's a little bit harder to find here. The space for ambiguity, we don't see so much. It's much more of a clear logic and formula about somebody who's better than us. He's having a certain kind of misfortune that's going to produce this certain kind of emotion. It's all very mechanical. Um, so those are in effect, the classic classicist elements of Aristotle. Whereas, the romantic creativity, breaking the rules, um, just trying new things, and the messiness of real life is something foreign to Aristotle. He wants universal truths, and for him, universal truths are all very clear. The distinctions between these emotions are very clear, and he wants stories that, if they follow these certain parameters, are going to produce those emotions, and that's going to produce the pleasure that's desired, and boom, the function is served. So those are a couple of criticisms of the classical aspect of Aristotle, and also another aspect of the classicism is this rigid social structure. We also see that he sees these differences in class and in gender, probably in race as well, and so one wonders, like, does the rigid approach to the logic that he takes to the story, does that carry with it the rigid social structure, and that kind of aristocratic, there's one class of people that's better than another? Do those things go hand in hand, or can we separate them out? So that's just kind of a question to leave you with as we reflect on Aristotle and Poetics, which is a key historical text, had a huge influence in just thinking about what the arts are generally, and especially literature, drama, and film.